There's a particular kind of panic that does not look like panic at all, the kind that hides behind curated smiles, controlled lighting, and the calm cadence of a brand voice that insists everything is intentional. Because the real fear is not that people are talking. It is that they're starting to stop. That is the atmosphere surrounding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry in the wake of Tom Bower resurfacing with talk of a follow-up project, a sequel to his 2022 book Revenge. And the timing matters as much as the material. Because a sequel announced when public interest is tired, partners are cautious. And every headline feels like a referendum, does not land like gossip, it lands like an audit. In late September 2025, an interview and promotional circuit around Bower signaled that a new book focusing on the next chapter of the Sussex story is aimed for early 2026. And whether you see him as a relentless investigator or simply a biographer who thrives on controversy, his reputation is built on the same claim, that he does not deal in vibes, he deals in sources, documentation, and the kind of cross-checking that makes legal threats feel less like deterrence and more like background noise. The unease in this moment is not just about what Bower might say. It is about what his return symbolizes, that the story is no longer about a dramatic exit from palace life, but about what comes after the spotlight stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like exposure. The cultural temperature has been moving in that direction for a while, and one of the clearest inflection points was not a court filing or a press release. It was a cartoon, the South Park episode that aired on February 15th, 2023, the Worldwide Privacy Tour. A satire that crystallized a growing contradiction into a single mainstream punchline. And once a contradiction becomes a meme, it stops being a debate and becomes an identity people project onto you. What makes that kind of moment dangerous is not the joke itself. It is the way it trains the audience to interpret every subsequent move as proof of the same thesis, that the couple wants control over the narrative while still needing the oxygen of attention. And from there, the public does what it always does. It compresses complex lies into a simple loop of expectation and reaction. Into that loop arrives the second pressure point, business and branding, because the Sussex brand was never only moral storytelling, it was also an economic bet, a promise that influence could be converted into durable enterprises. Meghan's lifestyle venture is part of that bet, and the transition from American Riviera Orchard to the rebranded as ever was presented as a clarifying step, an effort to broaden the concept beyond a single geographic aesthetic and align it with a larger media rollout. That rebrand was publicly announced on February 18th, 2025, tied to the broader lifestyle positioning around cooking, entertaining, and a Netflix-aligned moment. The kind of synergy that is supposed to make the audience feel like the products are simply an extension of a life they already want to watch. But synergy only works when the public wants to believe, and belief is exactly what becomes fragile when the third pressure point enters, the institutional side of reputation, especially charity. In May 2024, Archwell Foundation was listed as delinquent by California's charity registry over missing paperwork, with reporting noting the practical consequence that while listed that way, it was not permitted to operate or solicit donations in California until the issue was resolved. And coverage also emphasized that the situation was framed by representatives and observers as a compliance and filing problem rather than a declaration about the substance of the organization's mission. Even when an issue is administrative, it creates a headline, and headlines are what Bower-style narratives thrive on, because they allow an author to build a chain of implication, not always by proving a single catastrophic wrongdoing, but by laying out a pattern in which every misstep looks like part of the same system. Rushed launches, aggressive publicity, high overhead optics, and a constant need to keep the story moving forward before the last chapter has been properly closed. That is why a sequel is such a psychological threat, because it promises to revisit the entire arc with the benefit of outcomes, to treat each decision not as a moment of chaos, but as a breadcrumb leading to the same destination, and it invites readers to reinterpret even neutral events as evidence. In that sense, the most brutal possibility is not that the book reveals one new scandal, It is that it frames the last few years as a slow conversion of global sympathy into public fatigue, where the audience does not necessarily turn to hatred. It turns to indifference. And indifference is the one thing no rebrand, no documentary, and no carefully staged post can fix once it sets in. What makes Tom Bower's return uniquely destabilizing for Meghan Markle and Prince Harry is not simply his reputation, but the way his method reframes time itself. Because he does not chase breaking news, he waits for outcomes, and outcomes are unforgiving. When Revenge was released in 2022, the Sussexes were still cushioned by momentum, active streaming deals, sympathetic media lanes, and a lingering moral capital of having escaped an institution many audiences were already primed to distrust. That book landed like a provocation, controversial but incomplete because the story was still unfolding and the couple could plausibly argue that judgment was premature. A sequel announced in late 2025 operates in a different moral economy entirely, one where the question is no longer what they intended to build, but what actually survived. Bower has made clear through interviews that this next book is not about origins, but consequences, and that distinction is critical, because consequences strip away the protection of good intentions and replace them with balance sheets, timelines, and reputational aftershocks that cannot be reframed by optimism alone. In practical terms, this means the book is positioned to function less like an exposé and more like a reckoning, a systematic revisiting of choices that once looked bold but now appear fragile when measured against results. This is where the anxiety intensifies, because a narrative built on moral clarity struggles when evaluated through performance metrics, whether cultural, financial, or institutional. And Bower's entire brand rests on the promise that he can connect those metrics to human decisions in ways that feel inescapable. The collapse of major media partnerships feeds directly into that framing. Spotify's termination of the Sussex podcast deal, followed by the quiet tapering of Netflix enthusiasm after initial viewership spikes, created an industry shorthand that insiders understand instantly: high profile, high maintenance, low yield. Those labels do not need to be shouted to be effective. They circulate in boardrooms and agencies as cautionary whispers, and once they stick, they are extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. Bower's sequencing exploits that reality, because he can now write about ambition followed by contraction, vision followed by hesitation, and charisma followed by institutional fatigue, all without inventing drama, simply by aligning public announcements with subsequent retreats. This is also why cultural moments like the South Park episode matter so much in his framework. Satire alone does not destroy reputations, but it accelerates reinterpretation, giving audiences permission to laugh at what they once defended, and laughter is often the first step toward disengagement. Once that permission is granted, every new project arrives pre-filtered through skepticism, and skepticism is deadly to lifestyle branding, which depends on aspiration rather than argument. A candle, a jar of jam, or a curated recipe does not survive hostile curiosity. It survives trust, and trust is precisely what erodes when the public begins to suspect that presentation and reality are drifting apart. Bower's interest in the Sussex business ecosystem reflects this shift, because he is not merely cataloging failures. He is interrogating the structural logic that produced them, the reliance on press-first launches, the assumption that headlines equal demand, and the belief that celebrity itself can substitute for operational depth. That belief worked briefly because novelty creates grace periods, but grace periods expire, and when they do, numbers start speaking louder than narratives. The same principle applies to charity, which occupies an especially sensitive symbolic space in the Sussex story. Archewell was always positioned as proof that influence could be redirected toward purpose, that wealth and attention could be leveraged ethically rather than ostentatiously. Administrative problems, even if ultimately resolved, puncture that symbolism because they introduce friction between stated values and procedural discipline, and Bower thrives in that friction. He does not need to allege criminality to make his point. He needs only to show that the machinery did not run as smoothly as promised, that compliance lagged behind rhetoric, and that opacity crept in where transparency had been marketed as a core virtue. When layered together, these elements allow him to construct a thesis that is far more damaging than any single accusation. The idea that the Sussex brand became overextended, attempting to be moral movement, entertainment franchise, lifestyle authority, and charitable institution simultaneously, without fully mastering the constraints of any one domain. Overextension is not a scandal, but it is a pattern, and patterns are the raw material of Bauer's writing. Perhaps most unsettling is the way this approach reframes Meghan and Harry's internal dynamic, not as romantic defiance, but as strategic misalignment. Reports that Harry remains emotionally tethered to the idea of reconciliation with his family, while Meghan continues to pursue Hollywood validation and elite cultural capital, allow Bauer to explore tension without sensationalism, positioning it instead as incompatible endgames pulling in opposite directions. That tension does not need dramatic confrontation to be persuasive. It only needs to manifest as drift, hesitation, and misalignment, which audiences can recognize intuitively. In that sense, the sequel threatens not because it promises shocking revelations, but because it promises coherence, the kind of coherence that turns isolated controversies into a single explanatory arc. And once an arc is accepted, rebuttals become exponentially harder. Because you're no longer disputing facts, you are disputing interpretation. This is the trap the Sussexes now face, where every response risks reinforcing the very narrative they wish to escape, while silence allows the book to set the terms of memory by default. Bauer understands this dilemma intimately, and it is why his return feels less like an attack and more like gravity pulling a sprawling, emotional saga back toward a cold center of outcomes, where intention no longer matters as much as what remains standing when the noise finally fades. By the time a story reaches its third act, the question is no longer what happened, but why it unfolded the way it did. And this is where the Sussex narrative becomes less about scandal and more about structural collapse. What Tom Bauer is circling in this next phase is the machinery behind the image, the system that kept pushing forward even as warning signs multiplied, because collapse rarely arrives as a single explosion. It arrives as a series of ignored signals that only look obvious in hindsight. In Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's case, those signals were scattered across culture, commerce, and credibility, each small enough to be dismissed on its own, yet collectively loud enough to redraw public perception. The cultural signal was the shift from outrage to parody, because outrage still keeps a figure central, while parody begins to flatten them into a type. Once the South Park episode reframed the Sussexes as symbols rather than individuals, their story became transferable, a template audiences could drop onto any new headline, and that transferability stripped away nuance. Every press appearance, every product launch, every carefully staged image started to feel like another episode in a familiar series, and familiarity is the enemy of influence. The commercial signal followed quickly, as the logic of celebrity-driven enterprise ran headfirst into the realities of execution. Lifestyle branding is unforgiving because it lives or dies on repeat engagement, not one-time curiosity. A successful launch can create noise, but sustainability requires infrastructure, logistics, supplier relationships, and a consumer base that believes the product adds value beyond the personality attached to it. When headlines begin to focus more on the performance of the brand than the promise, the narrative flips, and questions about inventory, demand, and margins replace stories about vision and inspiration. Bauer's approach to this territory is particularly destabilizing because he does not treat business failure as embarrassment. He treats it as evidence of assumptions that were never tested, of a belief that attention itself could function as a substitute for operational rigor. That belief is common in celebrity ventures, but it becomes fatal when the celebrity in question has framed themselves as morally exceptional, because moral exceptionalism raises the bar for competence. The same dynamic applies to the charitable side of the Sussex brand, where symbolism mattered as much as outcomes. Archewell was positioned not just as a foundation, but as a corrective, a demonstration that power could be exercised responsibly outside traditional institutions. Any friction in that system, whether administrative, financial, or communicative, therefore carries disproportionate weight because it undermines the claim that this was a cleaner, more ethical model. Bauer does not need to accuse the foundation of malice to destabilize it. He needs only to show that it functioned like any other organization subject to human error, delay, and opacity. That is enough to puncture the myth of exceptionalism. And once that myth deflates, the entire narrative architecture begins to sag. What makes this especially potent is the way these external pressures intersect with internal strain. Stories emerging about diverging priorities between Meghan and Harry are not framed as betrayal or conflict, but as misalignment, a far more corrosive force over time. Harry's lingering emotional connection to the monarchy and desire for reconciliation sits uneasily beside Meghan's pursuit of validation within American celebrity culture, because those goals pull in different temporal directions. Reconciliation implies patience, restraint, and a willingness to soften edges, while Hollywood demands constant visibility, reinvention, and relevance. Trying to satisfy both creates a strategic paralysis where every move risks alienating one audience while failing to fully satisfy the other. Bauer's narrative power lies in his ability to present this not as gossip, but as inevitability, the predictable outcome of incompatible incentives operating under the same roof. As these pressures accumulate, the public's role shifts subtly from participant to observer. Early supporters who once felt emotionally invested begin to disengage, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion, because the story stops evolving and starts repeating. Media outlets sense this fatigue and adjust coverage accordingly, moving from breathless amplification to cooler analysis, and then eventually to indifference. This is the stage Bauer appears most interested in capturing, because indifference is the true end of celebrity power. When outrage fades, there is nothing left to monetize, nothing left to mobilize, and nothing left to threaten institutions with. The Sussex's attempts to reassert control through rebrands, new projects, or strategic silences risk backfiring in this environment, because each move is interpreted less as leadership and more as maintenance, an effort to keep a system alive that no longer generates organic energy. Bauer's forthcoming book positions itself as the chronicle of that transition, from influence to inertia, from central players to cautionary figures. What makes this third act particularly unforgiving is that it offers no clear villain to fight, no palace to escape, no media cabal to expose. Instead, it presents a mirror, reflecting how power erodes when narrative coherence breaks down and when actions fail to reinforce declared values. In that sense, the book threatens not because it promises new revelations, but because it promises synthesis, the weaving together of cultural mockery, commercial strain, institutional scrutiny, and personal misalignment into a single explanatory framework. Once such a framework takes hold, it becomes self-reinforcing, because every new data point slots neatly into the existing story. This is why the countdown to early 2026 feels so heavy, because the release of Bauer's sequel is less an event than a reckoning, a moment when years of diffuse skepticism could crystallize into a definitive account that future coverage will reference as baseline reality. Whether Meghan and Harry respond or remain silent may matter less than the fact that the narrative terrain has shifted beneath them. And in this new terrain, intention offers little protection, optimism reads as denial, and the past is no longer something to outrun, but something that has already caught up. Part 4 is where the narrative tightens and the margins disappear, because this is the point at which reinvention stops being aspirational and starts being defensive. By the time Tom Bauer's upcoming book enters this phase, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry are no longer operating from a position of momentum, but from a position of repair, and repair is always more visible than creation. Rebrands, strategic silences, and carefully timed appearances begin to look less like vision and more like triage, attempts to stabilize a structure that is already showing stress fractures. The shift from American Riviera Orchard to As Ever is emblematic of this moment. Not because rebranding is inherently a failure, but because rebranding under pressure invites scrutiny of motives. When a brand pivots early, it signals adaptability. When it pivots amid skepticism, it signals retreat. In this context, every aesthetic choice, every product tease, and every media partnership is no longer evaluated on its own terms, but as a response to what came before, a corrective rather than a clean slate. Bauer's framing thrives in this environment because it allows him to read intention backward, interpreting each new move through the lens of accumulated doubt. This is also where the Sussex media strategy begins to feel constrained by its own history. Early on, the couple benefited from a clear moral contrast: insiders versus outsiders, tradition versus progress, silence versus voice. That contrast energized supporters and simplified storytelling. But once that binary dissolved, once the palace was no longer the central antagonist, the narrative lost its organizing force. Without an external villain, internal coherence became essential, and coherence is precisely what falters when projects multiply faster than trust. A cookbook here, a lifestyle rollout there, a charitable initiative layered on top. Each one competes for attention while drawing from the same finite reservoir of goodwill. Bauer does not need to mock these efforts. He only needs to place them side by side and ask whether they add up to a unified strategy or a series of reactive gestures. The danger of this phase is that even neutral actions become interpreted as confirmation of decline. Silence reads as avoidance. Engagement reads as desperation. Transparency reads as spin. In such an atmosphere, control over perception becomes almost impossible because the audience has already chosen a frame, and frames are remarkably resistant to correction. This is why the focus on documentation and process becomes so powerful. Bauer's reputation rests on the idea that paper trails do not care about intentions, that filings, contracts, and timelines tell a story regardless of how carefully the public narrative is curated. When he revisits the Sussex ventures, he is not asking whether the ideas were noble. He is asking whether the execution matched the promise, whether deadlines were met, whether structures were sustainable, and whether outcomes justified the scale of ambition. These are questions that resonate far beyond celebrity culture because they mirror how credibility is evaluated in institutions, corporations, and politics. The Sussex story, once framed as a personal journey, is now vulnerable to being read as a case study in overreach, and case studies strip away emotion in favor of lessons. Perhaps the most uncomfortable aspect of this stage is the loss of narrative flexibility. In earlier chapters, setbacks could be reframed as learning experiences, missteps on a righteous path. In this chapter, setbacks accumulate, and accumulation creates pattern recognition. Once a pattern is recognized, audiences stop waiting for explanations and start waiting for confirmation. Bauer's work is positioned to serve as that confirmation, not by introducing shocking new events, but by organizing existing ones into a coherent sequence that feels inevitable in retrospect. This inevitability is what makes the moment feel heavy. It suggests that the outcome was not caused by a single bad decision or hostile force, but by a series of assumptions that went unchallenged for too long, assumptions about the durability of sympathy, the elasticity of credibility, and the power of attention to compensate for structure. The internal dynamics between Meghan and Harry become especially salient here, because repair requires alignment, and alignment appears increasingly strained. Reports of differing priorities, one oriented toward legacy and reconciliation, the other toward relevance and visibility, introduce a quiet tension that undermines strategic clarity. A brand cannot simultaneously move inward and outward without fracturing its message, And fracture is exactly what Bauer is likely to highlight. Not as personal conflict, but as strategic dissonance. Two vectors pulling the same entity in opposite directions. This dissonance feeds public uncertainty because audiences sense when a story is being told by committee rather than conviction. By the end of this phase, the Sussex narrative is no longer driven by aspiration, but by gravity, the weight of past choices shaping the limits of future ones. Every new initiative carries the burden of proof, not just that it works, but that it works differently from what failed before. That is an almost impossible standard to meet in real time, especially under the gaze of a biographer whose entire project is to slow the story down and examine it frame by frame. In that sense, Part 4 is not about collapse yet. It is about constriction, the narrowing of options as public patience thins and interpretive space closes. It sets the stage for what follows, a final reckoning not defined by drama or scandal, but by the quiet realization that the narrative has outrun the reality, and that catching up may require something far more difficult than reinvention, a recalibration of scale, ambition, and expectation itself. Part 5 is where the story stops asking whether the Sussex brand can recover momentum and starts asking a more uncomfortable question, whether momentum is even the right goal anymore. By this stage, the issue is not a lack of opportunity, but an excess of exposure, the kind that strips away mystery and leaves only mechanics behind. Tom Bauer's looming sequel sharpens this tension because it reframes visibility as liability, arguing implicitly that the more the couple tried to explain themselves, the narrower their room to maneuver became. In the early years, public curiosity worked in their favor, because curiosity forgives inconsistency. People lean in, fill gaps with generosity, and assume coherence will arrive later. But curiosity has a half-life, and when it expires, it leaves behind scrutiny, which is far less forgiving. Scrutiny asks different questions. It asks why certain strategies repeat despite disappointing outcomes, why announcements keep outpacing delivery, and why narrative resets appear more frequently than tangible results. Bauer's work is poised to weaponize those questions by arranging them not as accusations, but as patterns, a far more persuasive and durable approach. This is also the point at which the distinction between brand and person becomes increasingly blurred, to the detriment of both. Meghan Markle's public identity has been inseparable from the projects she champions, and that fusion initially amplified her influence. But over time, it has also meant that each project's perceived failure rebounds directly onto her personal credibility. When a lifestyle launch underperforms or a media partnership cools, it is not read as a market fluctuation, it is read as a verdict on judgment. That is a dangerous place to be, because judgment is cumulative. One misstep can be contextualized. Several begin to feel diagnostic. Bauer's narrative thrives on that diagnostic impulse, inviting readers to see the Sussex journey not as a series of isolated attempts, but as evidence of a deeper miscalculation about how power functions outside institutional shelter. Prince Harry's role in this phase becomes increasingly ambiguous, and ambiguity is rarely flattering. Once framed as the moral counterweight to royal rigidity, he now appears caught between identities, neither fully detached from the monarchy nor fully integrated into the commercial machinery his independence required. This liminality complicates the brand, because audiences struggle to understand what he represents beyond loyalty to Meghan and lingering grievance toward his family. Bauer is likely to treat this not as a personal failing, but as a strategic weakness, a lack of definitional clarity that undermines confidence among partners, donors, and collaborators. Brands, even human ones, depend on legibility. When legibility fades, trust follows. The charitable dimension magnifies this problem. Archewell was intended to anchor the Sussex narrative in purpose, to serve as proof that influence could be redirected toward measurable good. But charity is unforgiving to reputational noise. Donors expect discretion, stability, and procedural rigor, not constant repositioning. When headlines about administrative issues, staffing turnover, or opaque spending begin to circulate, even if explanations exist, they introduce friction into donor psychology. People do not want to investigate their philanthropy. They want it to feel unquestionably sound. Bauer understands this instinct well, and his focus on documents, filings, and organizational shift speaks directly to it. He is not trying to convince readers that the foundation is illegitimate. He is showing how legitimacy becomes fragile when storytelling outpaces stewardship. That fragility has consequences beyond money. It reshapes how the public interprets sincerity itself. Acts of generosity are reread as optics. Advocacy is reread as positioning. Silence is reread as evasion. Once this interpretive shift occurs, reclaiming authenticity becomes extraordinarily difficult because authenticity relies on being taken at face value, and face value is exactly what scrutiny dissolves. The Sussex's response options narrow accordingly. Speaking out risks reinforcing the perception of overexplanation. Staying quiet risks ceding narrative control to critics and biographers. Launching new ventures risks accusations of distraction. Retreating risks confirming decline. Bauer's project looms over all of these choices because it promises to freeze the story into a single account that future coverage will reference, making reactive course correction even less effective. Perhaps the most telling aspect of this phase is the emergence of indifference as a dominant public mood. Outrage has energy. Support has energy. Indifference has none. It does not mobilize, does not argue, does not share. It simply moves on. For figures whose power depends on attention, indifference is existential. Bauer's framing gestures toward this quietly, suggesting that the greatest risk facing the Sussexes is not backlash, but irrelevance, the slow erosion of cultural centrality as newer stories capture the public imagination. In this light, the sequel's threat is not that it will ignite controversy, but that it will codify closure, signaling to audiences that the era is complete, that the story has reached its explanatory endpoint. Once that happens, attempts to reopen it feel artificial. The gravity of Part 5 lies in this realization that the struggle is no longer against critics or institutions, but against time and attention themselves. Every brand, every public figure eventually confronts this moment when expansion gives way to consolidation and aspiration must be recalibrated against limits. The question is whether Meghan and Harry can recognize that shift and adjust their ambitions accordingly, or whether they will continue to chase a scale of influence that no longer matches the public's appetite. Bauer's book does not need to answer that question definitively. By assembling the evidence of contraction, fatigue, and misalignment, it only needs to pose it convincingly. Once posed, the question lingers, shaping how every future move is interpreted, not as the start of a new chapter, but as a response to an ending that may already be written. Part 6 moves beyond analysis and into consequence, because this is the stage where the story's center of gravity shifts away from intention and settles firmly on outcome. By now, the Sussex narrative is no longer contested in real time. It is being archived. Tom Bauer's forthcoming book accelerates that process, not by adding noise, but by organizing what already exists into a durable record. Archiving is a subtle form of power. It decides what is remembered, what is contextualized, and what is quietly left behind. Once a story is archived, it stops evolving and starts being referenced, and references have a way of flattening complexity into shorthand. This is the danger Meghan Markle and Prince Harry now face, the transformation from active protagonists into case studies, figures discussed more often in the past tense than the present. Bauer's role in this transition is critical because his work positions itself as definitive, not in tone, but in structure. He does not argue that his account is the only truth. He presents it as the most complete one, and completeness carries authority. In this phase, completeness becomes more influential than sympathy. Readers who once approached the Sussex story emotionally are invited to approach it analytically, to see patterns rather than people, systems rather than struggles. That shift changes everything. When audiences adopt an analytical lens, they stop asking how someone feels and start asking how something functioned. They evaluate decisions against benchmarks, not narratives, and benchmarks are merciless. The Sussex ventures, once judged by aspiration, are now judged by sustainability, scalability, and coherence. Bauer's framing emphasizes this by slowing the timeline, revisiting moments that felt fleeting when they occurred and placing them in sequence. Announcements that once seemed bold now look premature. Partnerships that once signaled prestige now look conditional. Silences that once read as dignity now look strategic. This reinterpretation does not require new facts. It requires distance, and distance is precisely what time and fatigue provide. The internal consequences of this shift are just as significant as the external ones. When a public narrative hardens, it constrains personal choice. Meghan and Harry are no longer free to experiment publicly without that experimentation being read as confirmation of instability. Each pivot is interpreted as evidence that the previous one failed. Each new initiative is framed as an attempt to outrun the last disappointment. This creates a paradox where movement becomes suspicious and stillness becomes suspect. Bauer's work feeds this paradox by documenting it, making the lack of safe options visible. The couple's autonomy, once the core of their appeal, begins to feel circumscribed by perception. That perception is reinforced by the changing media ecosystem. News cycles move faster, audiences fragment, and cultural memory shortens, but reputational summaries endure. Once a figure is categorized, future coverage often defaults to that category for efficiency. The Sussexes risk being categorized not as reformers or rebels, but as examples of overexposure, symbols of what happens when narrative control is mistaken for institutional power. This categorization is devastating because it is impersonal. It does not argue, it assumes. Bauer's contribution is to provide the language that makes such assumptions feel justified. He connects dots in ways that are easy to cite, creating a vocabulary that others can borrow without revisiting the underlying evidence. Over time, that vocabulary becomes the story. Another layer of consequence emerges in the realm of influence. Influence depends on unpredictability, the sense that a figure can still surprise or lead. Predictability drains influence because it allows audiences to preemptively interpret actions before they occur. The Sussexes are approaching that threshold. Their moves are increasingly anticipated, framed, and explained before they are even executed. This preemptive interpretation strips actions of impact. Even positive developments risk being dismissed as public relations rather than progress. Bauer's book threatens to lock this dynamic in place because it offers a master narrative through which all future actions can be filtered. Once such a filter exists, escaping it requires a rupture, not a rebrand. Ruptures are rare and risky, and they cannot be engineered easily. They often require withdrawal, patience, and a willingness to operate without immediate validation. This is where the tension between visibility and relevance reaches its peak. Meghan's instinct toward presence and Harry's instinct toward legacy pull in different directions, and Part 6 exposes the cost of that divergence. Legacy is built slowly, often invisibly. Presence demands constant reinforcement. Trying to satisfy both erodes the effectiveness of each. Bauer's narrative implicitly argues that this erosion has already occurred, that the Sussex project became too diffuse to sustain a clear through line. Whether that argument is fair is almost beside the point. What matters is that it is plausible, and plausibility is enough to shape consensus. As the countdown to the book's release continues, the sense of inevitability grows. Not inevitability of scandal, but inevitability of framing. The story will be told in a particular way, and resisting that telling will require either overwhelming success or deliberate disengagement. Neither option is simple. Overwhelming success requires trust that has been weakened. Disengagement requires surrendering the stage that once provided power. Part 6, therefore, captures a moment of narrowing, where choices still exist, but each carries heavier trade-offs than before. The Sussexes are no longer deciding how to expand their influence. They're deciding how to contain its decline. Bauer's work stands at the center of that decision, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. It reflects a version of the story that feels settled, orderly, and complete, and completeness is seductive. Once the public accepts that the story has been fully told, even if they disagree with details, the space for revision collapses. This is the quiet finality that defines Part 6, the realization that the battle is no longer over narrative dominance, but over whether the narrative can still change at all. Part 7 is not about revelation, but about residue, what remains after attention recedes and the story settles into memory. By the time Tom Bauer's sequel arrives in early 2026, the Sussex saga will no longer feel like a live controversy, but like a completed chapter, something audiences revisit rather than actively debate. That shift matters more than any specific claim the book might make, because memory is governed by summaries, not details. What people remember is not the nuance of every interview or the context of every decision, but the shape of the story as it hardened over time. Bauer's greatest influence lies in his ability to give that shape a clean outline, one that future discussions can reference without reopening old arguments. Once that outline exists, it becomes the default frame through which Meghan Markle and Prince Harry are understood, not as individuals navigating extraordinary pressure, but as a case study in how modern celebrity power can overextend and collapse under its own weight. The finality of this phase is subtle, because it does not arrive with a scandal or a courtroom defeat. It arrives with closure. Audiences sense when a narrative has reached its explanatory endpoint, when there are no longer unanswered questions that feel urgent. Curiosity drains away, replaced by a quiet certainty that whatever comes next will fit inside the same familiar pattern. This is the most difficult outcome to reverse because it is not driven by emotion, but by cognitive economy. People prefer stories that feel resolved. Bauer's book offers resolution by organizing years of events into a coherent arc that appears logical in retrospect. Whether readers agree with every conclusion is secondary to the comfort of coherence. That comfort encourages acceptance. For Meghan and Harry, this acceptance represents a loss of narrative leverage. Once a story is accepted as settled, responses are read as footnotes rather than turning points. Even strong rebuttals struggle to gain traction because they are framed as attempts to reopen a book the public has already placed back on a shelf. This does not mean the couple disappears, but it does mean their capacity to redefine themselves is constrained by a reputational ceiling. Their future actions are interpreted within the limits of an established storyline, and breaking out of that storyline requires more than messaging. It requires a visible break from the behaviors and strategies that define the previous era. The irony is that such a break often demands silence and restraint, qualities that run counter to the demands of celebrity-driven branding. Bauer's narrative implicitly argues that the Sussexes mistook presence for power, assuming that staying in the conversation equated to shaping it. In reality, power often lies in the ability to step back and allow time to reorder perception. The absence of that step back allowed critics, satirists, and analysts to define the terms of discussion, gradually eroding the couple's capacity to surprise. In the closing movement of this story, even sympathy becomes complicated. Sympathy thrives on vulnerability, but vulnerability becomes suspect when it appears repeatedly without resolution. Audiences begin to question whether vulnerability is being shared or performed. This question lingers over the Sussex narrative and is unlikely to be answered decisively because it rests on interpretation rather than evidence. Bauer's book does not need to resolve it. It only needs to present it as a reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt is enough to chill enthusiasm. The future, then, is not about redemption arcs or dramatic comebacks. but about recalibration. Meghan and Harry may still find meaningful roles, whether in philanthropy, private advocacy, or selective creative work, but those roles will likely be smaller, quieter, and more constrained than the global platform they once commanded. This is not necessarily failure. Many public figures evolve into less visible but more stable forms of influence. The challenge is accepting that evolution before the audience imposes it. Bauer's work accelerates that imposition by freezing the past into a definitive account. Once frozen, it resists reinterpretation. The final question hanging over this saga is not whether Meghan will respond or whether Harry will reconcile with his family. It is whether they will recognize the moment for what it is, an inflection point where persistence risks entrenchment and restraint offers the only path to renewal. In that sense, the story ends not with a verdict, but with a choice, one that will likely be made away from headlines rather than within them. If the Sussex era taught the public anything, it is that attention is a finite resource, and that once exhausted, it cannot be reclaimed through insistence. It can only be regained through absence, humility, and time. Bauer's sequel may close the book on a particular version of their story, but does not dictate their future. What it does dictate is the terrain on which that future must be built, narrower, steeper, and far less forgiving than before. Whether Meghan Markle and Prince Harry can navigate that terrain without repeating the patterns that led them here remains to be seen. What is certain is that the age of narrative expansion has ended. What follows will be defined not by how loudly the story is told, but by how carefully it is allowed to fade and, perhaps, slowly transform into something less spectacular, but more sustainable.